Welcome to the Northeast Kingdom Voice. I'm your host, Scott Wheeler. The war in Afghanistan is coming to what some people call a disastrous end. Today's guest is a man, a Northeast Kingdom native who was in Afghanistan, but not as a soldier, but as a reporter. Our guest is Darren Perrin of the WCAX News. Welcome to the show, Darren.
Thanks for having me, Scott.
You know, a lot of people probably don't know that, here you are, the big man on WCAX, but you're a Northeast Kingdom native, Barton Glover, isn't that correct?
That's right. I have a huge family up that way, about 50 first cousins, many still in the Northeast Kingdom, Scott.
Yeah. And I actually got my start in the writing world with you at the Chronicle. Wasn't those good training grounds?
Oh, man, I tell you, I learned so much from some of those veteran reporters there, like Bethany Dunbar and Tina Starr, Chris Braithwaite, of course. We both cut our teeth at the Chronicle, and I think we both learned a lot from those folks.
Yeah, I would take my years at the Chronicle as more educational than probably my 4 years of college in so many ways. So you made it to Afghanistan. You were embedded with the Vermont troops. How did that come about, and what year was that?
That was back in 2010, Scott. We had learned that Vermont was looking at the largest call-up of the National Guard since World War II, 1,500 of our men and women heading to the global war on terror. And I started chatting with one of the photographers here, Lance McKenzie, about that. And I kind of felt like, if we don't go there ourselves, we're not going to see exactly what our men and women were doing on the ground and in the air there if we just relied on the national news to cover what was happening in the war zone. Plus, on top of that, we learned that the Vermont National Guard was really in charge of the operations at that time in 2010. It sort of goes state by state. Different National Guards would lead for about a year, and Vermont was in charge in 2010. So we said, let's pitch it to the bosses. Let's see what they say about this. And at the time, the Martin family owned WCAX, and Peter Martin was president of the station, and he was a Vietnam vet. So we thought we had a pretty good chance of convincing the bosses to let us go, to embed with the Vermont National Guard. But we didn't know exactly how that was going to work because, we're not military. We had to pay our own way to get into the country. We flew in commercial air. We didn't have any gear at all. So we had to go out, buy all of our, flak suits, helmets, goggles, everything that would protect us while we were there. Obviously, we were not armed. We, armed with a camera, a pen, a notebook, and that's just about it. So we talked to Peter Martin. He looked into it. It was super expensive for the station. We're a small station, but they ended up spending, just in insurance alone, life insurance, medical insurance, tens of thousands of dollars to get us there. But they made the investment. We flew into Kabul, Afghanistan, and from there we embedded with the troops.
How did it feel from being, a Northeast Kingdom boy, suddenly being on the other side of the world in a war zone?
I describe it as frightening, fascinating, educational, and emotional because it was certainly all four of those things. We learned a lot about the Afghan people. We learned a lot about the country, but we also saw the atrocities of war and the atrocities that these people were living in under the Taliban rule. It was also fascinating to see just how our troops were working with the Afghan National Police and different village elders, because it's such a divided country, both geographically and politically. They're completely cut off, one village to the next village. So sometimes we would roll into a village and they thought we were still the Russians occupying the country because they are completely cut off from media and other villages to know exactly what was going on. So you'd roll into one village where you were getting thumbs up from mostly young people. The elders in some of these communities were just sick of occupation, sick of war. So they were not as friendly with the troops, but the younger people seemed to appreciate what the American troops were doing there. But then you'd roll into another village and it was hostile there. And, you know, that's where we were seeing fighting and war battles taking place.
Did you ever come under fire yourself?
We were in a couple of different places, namely it was Charikar, I believe the name of the town in which we left our base camp, and then we rolled in what they call MRAPs, or mine resistant ambush protected vehicles. And we rolled in, we took over what was a bombed out police station. They put up a bunch of barricades around that police station to prevent any suicide bombers from targeting that facility, where we stayed for about 3 days, I think. While there, we heard numerous explosions going on around us. That was probably our first experience in which we knew we were in a war zone, aside from seeing, you know, all of the bombed out buildings when we first arrived. And then on a foot patrol into a place called Kalana Suru. That's when things got really real for us. We were forced to spread out to minimize casualties because the troops got intel from one of the Afghan people there, who's an ally to American forces, saying that they had learned that there was a suicide bomber on a motorcycle, and that person was trying to target the largest group of soldiers that they could. So at that time, you know, again, Lance and I, not armed at all, but because the troops were worried about us and worried about the other troops involved in this convoy on foot into this village, we had to spread out. So, you know, we were now 50 to 100 feet away from any of the troops who had sort of, you know, surrounded us a little bit as we marched in. Fortunately, we did not see that suicide bomber, who was supposedly a teenage boy. Oftentimes, the Taliban was recruiting young men to take part in these suicide bombings. Another time we had visited a place called Panjshir Valley, which, Scott, I have to say, is probably one of the most beautiful places I've ever seen in my life. I said while I was there, if Afghanistan could get it together, this would be an incredible tourist destination. The rivers were just gorgeous in this valley, the mountains, 4 or 5 times the size of Mount Mansfield. It was just incredibly beautiful. And we were able to, for the first time, able to take our flak suits off, able to take our helmets off, because it had been protected, and it had been protected even when the Russians invaded, just because of how this place was set up geographically. They were able to put their military forces at the front of that valley to hold off anybody invading. So those people, very rare in Afghanistan, were able to live peacefully. Got there, everything seemed great. You almost forget that you're in a war zone because, you know, people were moving about freely. And then we get back into our MRAPs on the way back to base, and 4 vehicles in front of us got bombed.
Ooh. Did everybody get out?
Everybody, thank God, were able to get out of that vehicle. They loaded up the men from that. It was a coalition forces MRAP in front of us. And so that same road that we had traveled to get there was where this IED went off. And when that happened, you know, we were all sort of euphoric about the experience that we had just had in the Panjshir Valley. And then we just beelined through a desert area headed back to base, but not on that same road.
Were you, did you have anything on you? You know, were you wearing anything that designated you as meteor?
Not really, just the fact that we were carrying camera gear and notebook and pen, but nothing that sort of marked us as press. And I think in large part because you may remember at that time, the Taliban and other insurgents were kidnapping journalists and doing horrific torture to them as a way to send a message to the United States that, we'll even take your journalists at this point. So I think that in large part it was to not specifically identify us because of those kidnappings that were happening.
Well, Darren, as a writer myself, former reporter, it's the one thing I would worry about is we like to ask questions. And I asked my wife once when they were looking for reporters for Iraq. I said, hey, can I go to Iraq? She says, no, because she knew I'd go up to somebody I shouldn't and try to interview them. Was there ever any temptation to get outside your comfort zone and probably do something really stupid and try to interview somebody you shouldn't?
I was out of my comfort zone the entire 2 weeks we were there, Scott, to be
How long were
honest
you
with you.
there?
About 2 weeks on the ground. And, it's a long flight in and it's a long flight out, but 2 weeks, on the ground in Afghanistan. And the entire time we were there, we were completely out of our comfort zone. We're not military members. But I was able to, because we had a translator with us, interview people on the streets and talk to people. We spoke with village elders when we, met with them, because a lot of these missions involved trying to win the hearts and minds of the Afghan people. And that involved convincing the elders who are respected by the people living in these villages, to say, hey, they're okay, they're doing good things for our country. How they were doing that was money. Every place we went, the US had been spending about $5,000 per infrastructure project. And a lot of times it involved getting water to these villages, because even village to village, people were fighting over the only source of water. Somebody would have it in their village, they wouldn't have it in the next. So the US troops were helping to build this infrastructure that would divide waterways so that this village now had water and this village now had water. And that was sort of winning the hearts and minds. They were creating peace between villages. And that was sort of the mission that we saw there, building schools for girls. This, Scott, was huge because, as you may know, under Taliban rule, the harsh rules of Islam, they were not allowed to be educated. In fact, women were not allowed to leave their homes without an escort by a man who happened to be a relative. They had to cover every inch of their body. Oftentimes, you would only see their eyes to prevent any skin from showing. They couldn't work, they couldn't go to school, they had to live under these harsh rules. And so, for the US to help build a school for girls was just remarkable to see. It didn't look like a school, no school you'll ever see in your life, because it looked more like a prison. I mean, it was guarded by men with machine guns, both US troops and Afghan police, barbed wire all around this school, where hundreds of girls were walking every day, some for, 10 miles to get an education. And I spoke with a couple of young women there. They were probably, I'm guessing, 8, 10 years old, something like that, through the translator. And this was probably one of the more emotional things that I heard, just because I was so moved by what these little girls were telling me. And through the translator, I asked them, I said, okay, you get to go to school. What does this mean to you? What are you going to do? And they both raised their arms, and one said, I'm going to be a doctor. And the other one said, I'm going to be a teacher. And, seeing what's happening in Afghanistan now has just made me think about those two little girls who are probably, 19, 20 years old now. And I wonder what's happened to them. Are they okay? Have their dreams of being a doctor and a teacher just been crushed by what's happening now?
Well, that's a good transition. Is when you're watching the news now, and whether it be I think everybody seems to agree that things have not gone exactly as planned. How do you feel about everything you're seeing, whether it be the pullout itself or the people you're seeing left behind?
You know, as a journalist, you want to try to be as objective as possible when covering these kind of national and international issues. So all I can say is that I worry about the tens of thousands of people still trying to get out of the country. I know that about 25,000 people in 24 hours were evacuated from the Kabul airport, the only place not under Taliban control right now, but there are still tens of thousands of people still trying to get out. About 80,000 at last count had made it out since the middle of August, but there are tens of thousands, Scott. These are not only Americans, but the Afghan people who have assisted US troops over the last 20 years who were promised that they would be okay. And all I can say is that I worry about them because without those people, the US would not have been successful in Afghanistan. I mean, the Afghan National Police were fighting right alongside our US troops. We had translators over there who were critical in, talking to these village elders to make sure that they understood we were there to help them, to free them from the Taliban. And if those people don't get out as promised by the United States, that's a real tragedy.
Well, yeah, and that's looking right now very unlikely they will all get out. Did you work with one translator the entire time or different translators?
Primarily one translator. When we first arrived, we had different, because we moved around a lot. I mean, we wasted no time because we knew we were only going to be there for 2 weeks. And we wanted to see as many of the 1,500 men and women over there from Vermont as possible. So we were just on the move. I remember that the last camp that we went to, we were completely exhausted. I mean, we were working on a couple of hour nights, a couple of hours of sleep per night. And when you're in that kind of situation, your adrenaline is up, you are just on the move, it is constantly on the go. So we kind of crashed hard at that last camp. So we had a couple of different translators in a couple of different camps, but we did have one specific translator for, I would say, 5 or 6 days during our mission, who you get to know pretty well. I mean, you relied on this person to get you information because, we were not speaking the language. So we relied on this young man who, helped us significantly gather information.
Do you know where he is today?
No. And we have been trying to find out. Both my photographer, Lance McKenzie, and I have been talking. And as you can imagine, seeing what's going on has brought up a lot of emotions and thoughts about the people there, and specifically that translator. And Lance and I are trying to figure out how to find out where he is.
How did you've talked a lot about your experience there, but what about the soldiers you served with? How were they?
While we were there, just incredible. The amount of training was completely obvious. And, you think about war zones and you think about just the movies that you see and the hostile interactions. Those happened. That is absolutely the reality of war. But to see the other side of war, where our men and women were interacting with the Afghan people who a lot of times we're completely hospitable. We walked into one village, and it was a completely secret mission, but we went into this bunker area to meet with this family who, were terrified that the Taliban was going to find out that they were helping us. But while we were there, they were living in complete poverty, absolutely a mud hut kind of situation, had pieces of bread that they offered to us, and you clearly knew that bread for this family was extremely hard to come by. And at first, because of that, I was like, oh no, no, thank you. I appreciate that. Because we had food back at camp. And one of the soldiers said to me, take it. It's more insulting to them if you don't, because that is just part of the culture there, is to give when you have guests. And so, seeing that side of war was a side. And when I say the educational piece of this, that was completely educational for me. So you got to see a different side of war, and primarily through our men and women over there. And they had been trained to do this. Again, they saw combat, they saw hostility, they saw bombs. And as you know, some of our men and women did not make it back from that situation. But just to see how well trained our men and women are was really educational for me.
You've told me in the past, I think you came on my radio show shortly after you returned from Afghanistan. And you were saying even after 2 weeks, when you came home, it was kind of an adjustment period. Just because you go into the war zone, and I think it was you who said you even look at garbage cans on the side of the road differently because they might have IEDs in them. How long did it take you to get accustomed to home again?
You know, a while. And I hate to even talk about that because we were there for just 2 weeks. And I know that our men and women are coming home, many of them with the invisible wounds of war, PTSD. And so I don't want to make it sound like I am nearly as affected as our men and women who were over there for a year or more. But it took a little while, to be just straight up honest with you, because you are living in fear the entire time you were there. You were looking for anything out of the normal. Um, as you said, garbage bags, garbage cans, anything that seems out of place was something that sent off alerts through the entire convoy. If they saw something strange posted on a telephone pole, for example, or some kind of fence. I remember we were in a small village, and because they had done so many patrols through this village, one of the sergeants alerted the convoy over the radio. There's something attached to this pole on this fence. Someone's got to go check it out. And at that time, they were working closely with the Afghan National Police. The National Police went in as the troops stood back because they were slowly handing over the reins at that time for their own policing, and, checked it out. It was turned out to be nothing, but it causes alarm. And so it took a little while, to be straight up honest, that, anything you were, because you were like this the whole time, looking overhead passes, because that's where grenades were being thrown into the turrets at the top of, our military tanks and that kind of thing. You just are constantly on the lookout, and it did take a while. And, Lance and I, for a while, would gather, and on the anniversary of our departure to embed, we have celebrated every year. Celebrate is maybe not the right word, but gotten together every year to just remember and relive our experience there.
Yeah, the reason I asked you was just that was after only 2 weeks that had an impact on you. So can you imagine after a year tour what it must do? How
And
are
it's longer than that, Scott. In fact, I was just talking with a soldier yesterday in regards to what's happening in Afghanistan now, and he said it's bringing back a lot of painful memories, seeing what's happening in Afghanistan. He's worried about his other military members he served with, and all of the men and women who served in the global war on terror, because this is dredging up, a lot of emotion for these men and women who saw some pretty horrific things while they were over there. So I don't think it ends after, for Lance and I, yes, but for the men and women who lived this for a year or more, 15 months, many of them, I don't think it goes away as quickly as we all would wish.
From having friends also who are Vietnam veterans, I will say, even for them, this is bringing back memories of their own, like the airlift at in Saigon, and just the way the war ended to some degree. Uh, it's it's caused them to also reflect back on their war years. I think it. I've said I think this is a. It's certainly one of a historical event of our lifetime, and no matter whether it was done right or wrong, I think it's going to have a lasting impact on our country, because I think everybody wanted out, but I think it's going to have a lasting impact one way or the other, and hopefully it doesn't forever define who we are.
Yes, I agree with you.
So, okay, we only have say 3 more minutes. When you said, when you're surrounded by the news, what is your, when you watch the news, what do you hope for the country of Afghanistan and its people?
I worry about what Taliban rule is going to look like, particularly for women and children, and namely girls. And I also worry that this country will slip back into a terrorist nation. You know, they have said, the Taliban, that they want to be considered a legitimate country. That would probably open them up to some kind of money from other world governments, because right now nothing's going into them. No humanitarian effort is happening right now because they are not considered a legitimate government. The Taliban has said that they will, follow this deadline that the president has worked with them on, but they have called this a red line in the sand, that the August 31st deadline is the deadline. And it seems as though the US government is now listening to the Taliban. The Taliban is dictating when this pullout must be done. What happens if we don't meet that deadline is anybody's guess, but I worry that it does not mean good things for the Afghan people. And I worry that the tens of thousands of people still trying to get out won't make it out. And I worry, again, what this means, particularly for the women and children of that country.
Okay, Darren, thank you for coming on, and thank you for providing us your viewpoint, and thank you for all the work you do at WCAX. And it's been great to see a local boy make it big in the media world.
Well, thank you, Scott. Always nice to chat with you. I appreciate the invite.
All right, thank you. And thank you to the viewers for tuning in to another segment of the Northeast Kingdom Voice.